Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to explore something you might not expect, like how robots are actually impacting love, marriage, and family.
You probably think robots like stay in
Yeah.
factories, right?
Ugh.
But this deep dive, it shows how this big technology shift changes something really personal, how we have relationships, how we start families, all that.
Exactly. We'll be looking at this 2021 research paper. It's called Robots, Marriageable Men, Family, and Fertility. And it's from the CISFO group. They're like a network of top economists. And this study, it looks at the U.S. from 2005 to 2016.
Yeah, and that's important, because it lets us see what happens with robots over a longer time, not just like the first impact.
Right, right. So, like, what's the big picture here? How did the number of robots in the US actually change during that time?
Well, okay, get this. Back in 2005, there were like 1.3 robots for every 1,000 workers in U.S. factories. But by 2016, that number almost doubled, like 2.4 robots per 1,000 workers.
Whoa, that's a lot of new robots. And I'm guessing, like, they weren't all over the country, right? Were there, like, certain areas with more robots?
You got it. Figure 1 in the study, it shows this map of the U.S., and there are these like robot hotspots, places where way more robots were used.
Makes sense. Some industries, probably use robots more than others. So, what happened when all these robots joined the workforce? I remember, like, some older research said robots hurt wages and jobs at first. Did the study find the same thing?
Well, it's interesting. When they looked at the long term, it seems like the total number of jobs might have actually gone UP because of robots. But the average income, that went down.
So, more jobs, but less pay. Hmm. That's kind of strange. Is it maybe because manufacturing jobs lost to robots got replaced with like service jobs that pay less?
Yeah, that's probably a big part of it. But here's the thing. The effects on men and women weren't the same. Like men's incomes, they took a bigger hit, like a 5.8% decline, but women only saw a 1.6% decline.
Wow. So robots affected men's earnings more. What about like how many women were working? Did that change?
That's what's so fascinating. Way more women started working, but the number of men working barely changed. So guess what? The robots actually made the gender pay gap smaller. And the difference in how many men and women work, that got smaller too.
Hold on. So you're saying robots might have actually helped women in the job market? That's not what I expected at all.
Yeah, it's like an example of how technology can have these unexpected consequences.
Yeah.
Now, the thing about this, how do you think this all might have changed relationships?
Well, if women are doing better with jobs and men are worried about losing theirs, it seems like the power balance in relationships could shift. Could that mean changes in marriage and families?
You're on the right track. Let's dive into that. The researchers, they used information from the American Community Survey. It gives us a look at like thousands of real families across the country. And what they found is really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening. Did they find any changes in like how many people were getting married?
There was a small dip, about 1% less. But honestly, it wasn't a big enough change to be sure if it meant anything. Divorce rates, though, those changed a lot more.
Really? How much did they change?
They found like a 9% increase in divorce in those places with lots of robots. That's a pretty big jump.
Wow. Yeah, that is big. It seems like those economic changes we talked about, maybe they're part of this.
And it wasn't just divorce. More people were living together without being married, too. That went up by about 10%. So it's like people weren't giving up on relationships. They were just doing them differently.
So maybe like the traditional way of getting married is being challenged because of how things are changing with money and jobs. But what about having kids? Did the study find any changes in birth rates?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Overall, there was no change in how many babies were born. But when they looked closer, they found a big change in what kinds of families were having kids. Births within marriage, those went down by 12%, which is a lot. But births outside of marriage, those went up by 15%.
Wait, so even though the same number of babies were born, the types of families having kids were changing. It seems like robots might be part of why more families are forming outside of marriage.
Exactly. It shows how all these things, jobs, relationships, families, how they're all connected.
This is so interesting already, and we've just started. So just to make sure I get this, we've seen how robots changed jobs in the US, especially for men. And it seems like those job changes might be connected to changes in marriage, divorce, and what kinds of families have kids. Is that right?
You got it. And we're just getting started. Next, we'll look at how the researchers made sure these changes were really because of robots and not something else.
Okay, this is making me think about technology in a whole new way. I can't wait to hear more.
So You might be thinking, how do we know these changes in relationships are really from robots?
Hmm.
Couldn't it be like something else?
Right. It seems like a big jump from factory robots to, changes in our love lives. How did the researchers actually show it was the robots and not something else going on with the economy?
They used this cool method. It's called a Bartik instrument. It's like imagine a control group in a science experiment. They looked at how many robots were being used in different industries over in Europe because Europe already had more robots.
Oh, I see. So they used Europe to see how robots were affecting those specific industries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they used that information to predict like how much each part of the U.S. should have been affected by robots based on what industries were in that area. It's a way to like separate the effect of robots from other big economic stuff happening.
That's clever. Did they find that those predictions matched up with what was really happening in the U.S.?
Oh, yeah, they did. Their predictions and the actual robot use in different U.S. regions, they lined up really well. You can see it in figure 2 of the study. It makes us more confident that, those changes we're seeing in families are really linked to the robots.
Okay, that's pretty convincing. But what about things that were already happening? Like, is it possible those places with more robots, maybe they already had more divorce or more kids born outside of marriage before the robots even came along?
That's a great point. The researchers actually thought about that too. They checked the 1980 and 1990 U.S. censuses way before robots were really a thing. And guess what? They didn't find any signs that those areas were already changing in that way.
So it's not like those areas were already headed towards more divorce or non-marital births. It seems like the robots really are causing these changes. But did they look at any other things that could be part of these trends?
They did. They checked to see if people were moving away from those robot-heavy places, because that could mess up the results. But even when they only looked at people who stayed in the same area, the results were the same.
So it's not just about people moving, the changes are actually happening within those places. Did they look at specific industries?
Yeah, they did. They found that the electronics and auto industries, those industries use lots of robots, and they definitely played a role. But even after they took those industries out of the analysis completely, the results stayed the same. It really seems like it's the robots, across lots of different industries that are having this effect.
Wow, that's a lot of evidence pointing to the robots. But did they consider trade with China or family policies? Those could affect jobs and family decisions too.
Right, you're right. They looked into those things too. They even factored in things like access to contraception and abortion. But the robot effect was still there.
Wow, they really did cover all the bases. So it seems like robots are playing a role in how families are forming in the US. But remember, this study only goes up to 2016.
Right. And things have changed a lot since then. Technology keeps advancing. Makes you wonder, have those trends continued or have things changed direction?
Yeah, what's happened in the years since this study? It's something to think about as robots become even more a part of our everyday lives.
Definitely worth exploring. But before we go there, let's dig a little deeper into what this study found. Did they find any differences in how robots affected people of different ages? Did younger people react differently than older folks?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm curious to hear about that.
Well, they did find some age-related differences. For example, the impact on having kids within marriage. That was strongest for people between 30 and 50 years old.
Yeah, that makes sense. Those are the prime years for starting families. What about the effect on births outside of marriage?
There, the effect was stronger for people under 30. Seems like maybe younger people are more flexible with those changing economic realities and how ideas about family are changing.
I wonder if maybe younger people are just less tied to those traditional ideas about gender roles and family. But was the impact on families only about when people had kids, or did it also affect family size, like how many kids people have in total?
They actually found that robots affected both the timing of having kids and the total number of kids.
So robots aren't just changing when people have kids, but how many they have overall. That seems like a big deal for, demographics and how families are structured in the future.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just a temporary thing either. They even looked at completed fertility, which means how many kids a woman has by the end of her childbearing years. Even there, they saw the same pattern. Fewer kids born within marriage and more kids born outside of marriage.
Wow, so those effects of robots on family size, they seem to really last. It makes you think about how our ideas about family are changing in response to all this technology.
Exactly. But, before we move on, there's one more important thing we should talk about from this research. Did they look at how robots affected same-sex couples?
Oh, that's a great point. Since same-sex couples don't always fit that traditional husband as breadwinner model, I'd imagine the effects of robots could be different for them. Did the study have any insights on that?
They did. And it's pretty interesting. They found that robots didn't really have any effect on how many kids same-sex couples had, or their divorce rates, or how many were living together. But they did see fewer same-sex marriages in those places with more robots.
That's surprising. I wonder if that means even in same-sex relationships, those societal expectations and pressures about money and jobs, maybe they still influence the decision to get married.
It could be. It really shows how complicated all this is, economics, technology, and societal norms. Even if couples aren't following those traditional gender roles, those roles still exist in society, right? And maybe the way robots are changing the economy is making those roles even stronger, and in like a subtle way.
That's fascinating. It seems like this deep dive is showing how robots aren't just changing factories, they're affecting the core of how we form relationships and families.
Exactly. And it brings up a ton of questions about the future, like what happens as robots become even more a part of our lives?
That's a big question. It seems like we need to keep an eye on these trends and think about what kind of future we want as technology keeps changing.
For sure. This study, it's given us a lot to think about, but it's just the beginning. There's still so much more to learn as we go deeper into this world of robots, relationships, and families.
I'm already thinking about all the questions this brings up. This has been an awesome journey so far. But before we wrap up, I want to hear your final thoughts. What's the main takeaway from all of this? What does it all mean for us as we, navigate this world with more and more robots in it?
I think the big takeaway here is, like, robots aren't just changing how factories work, they're changing how families work too.
Yeah.
Whether affecting jobs and the economy, it's like rippling out and touching these really personal decisions about love, marriage, having kids, you know.
Yeah, it's like robots are this like hidden force shaping the future of families, even if we don't see it. And these aren't just, small temporary changes either, right? It seems like we're seeing these long-term shifts that could like totally change what family looks like in the future.
Exactly. And it's up to us, to really think about these changes, to have conversations about, like, what kind of future we want as technology keeps, moving forward. We have to think about, like, what's good, what's bad, and how we can, adapt and make it work.
This whole deep dive has been like really eye-opening. It's easy to think technology is this separate thing from our lives, but this research shows how connected they really are.
Yeah, it reminds us that technology isn't, like, neutral. It changes our lives in big ways, even in places we don't expect.
Hmm.
And as robots and all these other technologies, become more a part of our lives, it's really important to pay attention to how they could be affecting everything, like our jobs and our relationships.
So well said. So for our listener who's been with us this whole time, what's like the one thing you want them to take away from this deep dive?
I'd say pay attention. Pay attention to the, like, quiet ways technology is shaping your life, your relationships, the whole world around you. Don't just, like, let it happen. Ask questions, look at it from different angles, and be a part of shaping the future you want.
I love that. It's a call to action for everyone. Don't just watch as technology changes things. Get involved, understand it, and help make it better.
Exactly. This research has given us this glimpse of how robots are changing families, but it's just a start. There's still so much more to discover and explore.
This has been a truly fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive. I encourage you to check out the study yourself and think about like how these findings connect to your own life. What are your thoughts on how robots are changing relationships and families? What kind of future do you see as technology keeps evolving? Keep thinking about these questions, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.